We're going to look at the difference between food allergy and food intolerance. I'm here with Lindsay, who's got some questions to ask on the subject.
I've been told I suffer from food intolerances. I just wondered if you could explain to me the difference between a food allergy and a food intolerance.
Okay. Food allergy occurs when the immune system reacts to a food, either by making antibodies to fight the food off, or occasionally immune system cells themselves become inflamed in the presence of the food, and that causes symptoms. So food allergy is all about the immune system reacting against something. In food intolerance, the immune system isn't involved. There are lots of other ways in which foods can affect us that don't involve the immune system, and it's those sorts of reactions that we call food intolerance.
Okay, so would my migraines be caused by a food intolerance?
Well, things like migraine and irritable bowel and even things like arthritis can be caused by food intolerance, although that's not always the case. So the first thing to say is it's important to rule out other reasons why you might have things like headaches or gut symptoms. Make sure there isn't some other cause for that. But provided we're happy that there aren't any other causes, then it's worth considering whether diet might play a part. Now, I said there are lots of different ways in which foods can affect us that don't involve the immune system. For example, if we think of things like caffeine in chocolate and coffee and tea, most of us, if we had a lot of strong coffee, for example, would get a rapid heart rate and a tremor and feel sweaty and agitated, because caffeine has that effect on people. But most of us can cope with a few cups of coffee without getting those symptoms. However, some people are extra sensitive to things like caffeine, so even if they just have one cup of coffee, it produces a rise in heart rate and makes them feel jittery and so on, and can cause headache, for example. So that would be one form of food intolerance caused by an increased sensitivity to something in the food. Other sorts of intolerances can be caused by things like enzyme deficiencies. So we all have lots of enzymes which break down the components of certain foods when we eat them. And if we have an enzyme that's not working particularly well for some reason, so we don't break down the component of the food properly, then that food can affect us. Most people, I think, have heard of lactose intolerance. Lactase is an enzyme which breaks down lactose, which is the sugar found in milk. Normally, if you have enough of the enzyme, then when you drink milk, you break lactose, the sugar, down into smaller sugars, and you can absorb those, and there's no problem. But if you are deficient in lactase, deficient in the enzyme, then when you drink milk, you can't break the sugar, lactose, down properly, and it carries on through the gut undigested, and it can cause symptoms. So enzyme deficiency is another way in which foods can affect us, which has nothing to do with the immune system, and therefore it's not allergy. And there are other substances in foods like histamine. Histamine is the chemical that's released in the body during an allergic reaction, but some foods contain histamine naturally, and some people seem to be not very good at processing the histamine found in food. So if they eat lots of foods that are rich in histamine, that can produce symptoms. And similarly, some plant foods, fruits and vegetables, contain things called salicylates. And again, some people are sensitive to salicylates and can be affected if they eat a lot of foods that are rich in salicylates. So these are all different examples of ways in which foods can produce symptoms, but they're not related to allergy.
I found it quite difficult to pinpoint what is causing the headaches. What's the best way to go about finding out what might be causing the problem?
The only reliable way of finding out is elimination and challenge. So you eliminate the suspected trigger food for a period of time, usually about 2 weeks, and see if your symptoms go away, and then reintroduce the food again and see if your symptoms come back. It can be useful to keep a food diary, recording what you eat and also when you get your symptoms, and see whether you can pick up any obvious relationship between certain foods and your symptoms to narrow down what you think the triggers might be. With most conditions, there are also foods that we know tend to be more often associated with certain symptoms, so that might give us a clue of what sort of things might be triggering the symptoms. Then we would take a diet history to see what sort of things you're eating. Once we've done that, then you eliminate the food that we think might be causing the problem. That needs to be done strictly. So the mistake people make sometimes is that if they think milk might be causing their symptoms, for example, they just cut down their milk intake, or they stop drinking milk but they are still eating cheese and yogurt, for example. So you do need to eliminate the food or food group strictly, and it does need to be done for long enough, not just a day or two, but for about 2 weeks. But if you do that and your symptoms go away, and then when you eat the food again the symptoms come back, that's a fairly reliable guide that that food is causing your symptoms.
So would that be safe to do on my own at home?
In someone who is otherwise fit and well and is not underweight, for example, it's reasonable to exclude single foods or small food groups on your own at home and see if you can identify what the problem is. But people who are otherwise unwell or who are underweight or who've got other medical conditions shouldn't do food eliminations at home without seeking advice. So normally these things should be done under the direction of a specialist or a dietitian with an interest in food intolerance, for example. The other important thing to note is that you do reintroduce the food after the end of the exclusion. So for example, if you cut a food out of your diet and your symptoms don't get better, then you should reintroduce the food and back into your diet again. Sometimes people exclude a food and their symptoms don't get better, so then they cut another food out of their diet and they still don't get better, so they cut another food out, and after a while they're eating a very restricted diet and actually the symptoms aren't any better. So the important thing in elimination challenge is that you do challenge the food at the end of the elimination. If it's causing a problem, then you need to leave it out of your diet for a while. But if it's not causing a problem, reintroduce it to your diet and carry on eating it normally.
I've seen an advert in my local health food shop for allergy testing. Would that be worth having carried out?
Unfortunately, probably not. I think the first important thing to say is that although these tests are called allergy tests, they're actually not usually tests for allergy. Allergy tests are things like skin prick tests and IgE blood tests, which look for the antibodies that are involved in allergy. We know that people with, for example, quite severe peanut allergy who go and have health food shop allergy tests done, often the peanut allergy isn't detected by those tests because they're not actually tests for allergy. In terms of whether they're any good for identifying intolerances, most of these sort of tests are not validated and not reproducible, and they're not regarded as a reliable way of identifying food intolerances, so we wouldn't recommend them.
So does that mean if I find a trigger for my migraine that I'll never be able to eat that food again?
Well, with allergy it often only takes a small amount of the food to set a reaction off, so you do normally need to avoid the food completely. But intolerance is often different. With intolerance you can often cope with a certain amount of the food, it's only if you have too much of it or have it too often that it triggers the symptoms. So most people can establish a threshold, and if they keep below that threshold they'll manage the food okay, but if they have too much of it, it will trigger symptoms off. With intolerance you often regain tolerance over time, so if you identify that a particular food or food group causes a problem and you avoid it for a few months, it's well worth trying to reintroduce it and seeing if it still causes the same problems, because you may find that your tolerance has improved and you can then manage that food okay.
Hello, my name's Paula, and I really hope you can help answer some questions I have on food intolerance. I'm 43 and I've been suffering with milk intolerance all my life. I have lots of different problems, mainly stomach related. I get violent sickness and really bad diarrhoea, which is a real pain when you go out for a meal with your family to a restaurant, and I don't have such a good time. Anyway, I've got a few questions. The first one, how common is food intolerance?
I don't think we really know how common food intolerance is. The figure of 45% of people having a food intolerance is often quoted. A lot of food intolerance is probably quite mild, and frankly we probably needn't worry about it too much. If you get a little bit bloated after eating wheat, that's not of any great importance and there's probably nothing you need to do about it. Of course, for people whose food intolerance causes more severe symptoms like migraine or irritable bowel to the extent that they can't go out of the house, then that is much more relevant and it does need to be managed. But I don't think we really know how many people are affected in that way.
My second question, do different foods cause different reactions?
Almost any food can cause almost any sort of symptom in different people. Food intolerance, like food allergy, can be quite distinctive from one person to another. On the other hand, we know there are certain foods that tend to cause problems more often than others, and certain foods which tend to cause certain symptoms. So for example, migraine is often caused by the amine foods rich in things like histamine, such as cheese, chocolate, red wine, and perhaps fish, shellfish, and certain other high histamine foods. And bloating and irritable bowel seems often to be caused by wheat and other grains.
And my third one, when should I see a specialist?
If your symptoms are very mild, such as the occasional migraine or just bloating, and you're otherwise fit and well and you're not underweight, then you probably don't need to see a specialist. Those sorts of symptoms are probably manageable at home or with the help of your GP. But if your symptoms are more severe, so for example if you're getting migraines very frequently, or you've got persistent headache, or you have any other sorts of symptoms associated with headache like visual disturbance or dizziness, then you do need to see your GP to begin with. Similarly, if you have irritable bowel type symptoms but you're passing blood or getting persistent abdominal pain or you're losing weight, then you should certainly see your GP and you may well be referred on to see a specialist. You should also see a specialist if you have any allergy-like symptoms associated with foods, for example swelling of the lips, itching mouth, wheezing, or a generalised rash. It's important to get advice if you think you may have food intolerance, but unfortunately it can be difficult to get that advice from your GP or hospital specialists. If you do feel that you need advice, you can find more information about food intolerance through the Allergy UK website, or phone one of their helpline advisors and they'll be happy to talk to you.